Just have a couple slides and a couple of living props. I mostly want to take just a few minutes to share some observations about conservation and conservation success from someone who's been a conservation advocate for 40 years now. Briefly, the Murie Center is located on the Murie Ranch in Grand Teton National Park. We're a partner of Grand Teton Park. Our mission is to bring people together to inspire action that protects nature. We have three stewardship components to that: the Murie Archives, the Murie Ranch, which is a National Historic Landmark, and the Murie Legacy. And I want to talk to you a bit about the Murie Legacy. We celebrate and interpret the legacy of four great conservationists that lived throughout the 20th century. They were all biologists, writers, and artists, and they set a tone for respect in conservation that has led to great success in the last half century. We think it's this approach that's most needed in conservation today. The Muries knew the essential value of applied science to management and conservation decision-making, and that partnerships were key to success. There were four Muries: Olaus and Adolf, Marty and Louise, two half-brothers that married two half-sisters. Their legacy is one of the highest aspirations for kindness, but one that was highest aspirations for conservation, but one that was delivered with great kindness. I have a letter Marty wrote me in 1989, quoting Olaus: "It's going to take us all to do it." That was their conservation philosophy. Olaus Murie was particularly known for going where the science took him and for having courage. In the 1930s, wildlife or predator elimination was the rage, and the Biological Survey at the time was very involved in removing predators from across the western landscape. For years, Olaus quietly examined thousands of scats and hundreds of coyote stomachs and determined that at most 10% of their diet had anything to do with ungulates. Most of it were rodents, grasshoppers, reptiles, and not large herbivores. At the time, he went very much against his cohort. There was a lot of momentum in predator removal, but Murie went where the science took him. I have a recent email from Olaus and Marty's son Donald that recounts their style. "My parents won the respect of both allies and opponents by their calm, non-confrontational, and reasoned approach. They never accused, they never shouted, they never insulted." Or as the late author Patty Laser wrote, "Marty knows how to diffuse radical exuberance without derailing youthful enthusiasm." Murie admirer Pat Chadwick put it even more closely: "Compromising to make a deal does not mean you compromise your ideals." Yet, who in a mission-driven field like ours wants to be known as a great compromiser? Yet all of the victories that we celebrate were in fact compromises. My friend Dennis Hayes, who was the originator of Earth Day, recently wrote me, "Of course we should forge the best deal possible, install a ratchet for future progress, and move on. Our triumphs, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, Superfund, were all compromises from larger goals that we started out with." We're now celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act. As you know, the Wilderness Act was signed by President Johnson September 3rd, 1964. It's regarded as one of the Murie's greatest achievements, and they worked for many years to encourage Congress to pass this act. Yet when it passed, at the time it passed, there were 570 million acres in the public land estate. Only 9 million acres were protected. About 1.5% of what might have qualified was put into the wilderness system in 1964. But the Muries accepted this compromise, and with it a ratchet, as Dennis Hayes referred to. That was called the National, the Roadless Area Review and Evaluation process. That process was collaborative, it was inclusive, it was deliberate, and over the last 50 years, we've added 100 million acres to the wilderness system. Every president, everyone has signed new acres into the wilderness system. President Reagan signing the most into the system. Marty Murie also attended meetings on the Alaska Lands Act, and I was a young volunteer at the time working to encourage passage of the Alaska Lands Act. At the time, the compromise that we ended up with was not everything we asked for, but it was 44 million acres of new national parks, 20 times the size of Yellowstone. It was 54 million acres of new wildlife refuges, essentially doubling the system. It was quite an accomplishment, but it too was a compromise. Our nation and our world are running out of the gift of time. And if we want to do right by future generations, I think it's critical that we pursue our goals, our environmental and land protection goals, more strategically and pragmatically than ideologically. In the 1960s and 70s, when people worked together, we established a framework for environmental stewardship. We established a new agency, the Environmental Protection Agency. We passed the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act, Forest and Rangeland Renewable Resources Planning Act, the National Forest Management Act, the Federal Land Management and Policy Act, and the Toxic Substance Control Act. The Clean Air Act passed by 73-0 in the Senate and 374-1 in the House. The Endangered Species Act passed 92-0 in the Senate, 355-4 in the House. NEPA passed unanimously in the Senate and in the House, 372-15. None of these laws were perfect, but they were all a start. They were all a compromise. Within a decade of passage, all these laws were reauthorized. We took learning and we codified it and reincorporated it into the law. Since 1970, reauthorization of all these basic environmental statutes and many others have been the casualties of gridlock. We have not reauthorized any of the major national environmental infrastructure legislation of that era since 1990, 24 years. The last one that we authorized in 1990 was the Clean Air Act, when President George H.W. Bush and his EPA administrator, Bill O'Reilly, brokered a compromise, and the Clean Air Act was reauthorized. I spent a good part of the 1980s working on that issue. We got 10 million tons of sulfur out of the air. We wanted 16. It was a compromise. This is the deposition across Eastern and North America around the time that the bill was passed. And if you hit the next slide, you'll see deposition in Eastern North America 14 years later. This is the monitoring that Craig was referring to. We have monitoring for this action of the conservation community. And you can see it was dramatic across a large portion of Eastern North America, aquatic ecosystems, forests, agricultural productivity, and even impacts on buildings were all positively affected. Again, we didn't get everything we wanted, and involved in that was an emissions trading scheme, which greatly reduced the cost of compliance beyond what anyone thought, that a number of the environmental community were deeply suspicious of. That emissions trading scheme is called cap and trade, and of course it's now what we're talking about in terms of climate change strategy. Compromise also saved the Earth another time in the 1980s. You may remember that in 1974, two scientists, Sherwood Rowland and Mario Molina, discovered that a popular class of industrial chemicals, CFCs, were burning a hole in the ozone that protects the Earth from ultraviolet rays. You may know that CFCs originally came into use in the 1930s as a substitute refrigerant for methane, which blew up, and for sulfur dioxide to poison people. So it looked like a great deal at the time. It was very inert. It didn't seem to do anything until we discovered 40 years later that it was in fact threatening life on Earth as we know it. At that time, scientists, government people, environmental community came together, worked together, and in a very few years came up with a compromise, the Montreal Protocol, which President Reagan signed. The good news is now, you may have seen in the news in the past few weeks, the ozone hole is now rebuilding. It's being healed, and the manufacturers, CFCs, and their distribution worldwide has essentially stopped. And it's projected by the end of this century, they will be removed completely from the atmosphere. Again, this was a compromise. It took longer than we had anticipated. We gave longer than we had hoped for nations to comply. We gave developing nations even more time, but it was indeed a compromise. So as we struggle to deal with all these issues, from climate change to wildlife management in the GYE, there is no one size that fits all. But overall, I think we have two choices. Good faith engagement and compromise, like the Muries did, well known for reaching out to people from all walks of life and being good listeners, or failure. We simply can't have it, one way or the other. I know that some of our cohort won't agree, and I understand that. I hate compromise. I wish everybody would do it my way. So if any of this makes sense to you, I invite you to come out and visit us at the Murie Center sometime. I also have a book out, Green and Gridlock, Common Goals, Common Ground, and Compromise, that I'd be glad to refer you to. So thank you very much.